Premier League was back in action this week, with grounds around the country paying their respects to the late Queen. As football stood and reflected for a moment. In a weekend where English football finally got to pay its respects to the late Queen, 7 games went ahead in the Premier League this weekend, and the most notable one being is probably Leicester City's 6-2 defeat to Tottenham Hotspurs, which sees Brendan Rodgers on the precipice of the sack. He's now odds-on favourite to go next. I've got Dave and Myles both with me today to go through what's been a pretty sombre weekend for the UK. But football, of course, always brings a little bit of joy to us all, doesn't it? Apart from Leicester fans, it would seem. So, Myles, first of all, I'll start with you. How's it going? You went to the WSL opening weekend this time around, didn't you?
Yeah, it was brilliant. Really nice to be there for the first game of the season and to see it at Villa Park. About 7,000 people there as well, which is excellent crowd. And Villa getting a really shocking result against Man City. It was brilliant.
Back to the Premier League, though. Dave, Leicester losing to Tottenham 6-2. They were at 2-2 at one point and capitulated, it's fair to say. It was not a pretty performance from Leicester's defence. Son Heung-min coming off the bench and grabbing a hat-trick to kickstart his season. Brendan Rodgers, is he on his way out, mate? What do you think?
We've obviously spoken about it over the last few weeks, and the absolute turmoil that the club are in. Really, not just issues with the manager. I just think there's so many players there. Their minds just aren't focused. It seems a lot of problems really that are piling up, and it's just created an almost irreversible fix for Brendan Rodgers. I can't really see how he can turn it around. I think that's really sad to say, because I don't think he's a bad manager at all. I think he's a really good coach, but I think it's beyond him now, this job. I think they do need change.
I spoke to a couple of Leicester fans as well, and they're of the opinion that change has got to happen. But I think everybody's finding it difficult to find a place to lay the blame. Myles, is it the fault of Brendan Rodgers based on the defensive performance of the team last time out and the whole season so far? Surely it's more than just Rodgers' fault.
I'm not sure, because to a degree, I agree with Dave that he's always been a very good coach, and particularly at that sort of level, we were really impressed with what he did at Leicester. But the defensive mishaps of Leicester over the last season and a half now, we can say, you have to put that at the coach, how they're not identifying the same problems over and over again and finding a solution. Now, granted, they lost Fofana in the summer. They brought in a new centre-back that's got to adjust to a new system. They lost Kasper Schmeichel and are now playing a subpar goalkeeper. He's terrible, Danny Ward is. He's absolutely awful. And then you're also seeing players like Ndidi, who we've been praising on this podcast since we started recording, really making silly mistakes. But the same things keep costing Leicester. They look good going forward. Maddison obviously looks fantastic. But as a unit at the back, they just look so weak. And that has to come down to the coach and his staff, surely. If you're conceding from set pieces twice in a game every week, the coach has to deal with that. And yeah, I think it is time for a change. I imagine if it wasn't for the fact that the whole country is in a state of mourning today in particular, then we probably would have had some news before we started recording. I wouldn't be surprised if we hear it tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it's the writing's on the wall, I think, for him. If not now, then very, very soon, isn't it? He's definitely the next person to leave, because how can he recover from the kind of performances that have been put on display so far this season? Not just the performances, I think the willingness from him to kind of come out fighting. It doesn't seem like he's got any fight left in him. And that really bothers me. I think as a fan, body language plays a big part in these kind of situations, and his looks kind of lost, doesn't it?
His comments after the game as well suggest that he knows. He said, look, the last 6 games haven't been good enough. I think we can come out the other side, but the owners will do what they've got to do. And as soon as he said that, I thought, I think they've already had a conversation, to be honest. They'll wait till the end of the weekend for everything to pass, to be respectful and not look like they're trying to take headlines. And then I think, it will probably go tomorrow.
It's strange though, because who do you turn to as a club the size of Leicester City to replace someone like Brendan Rodgers? Because he is their level almost, isn't he? He's probably slightly above their level based on his recent achievements, but they are where they are. So if they were to swing the axe and get rid of him, Dave, who do they go for next? I've seen Mauricio Pochettino is the favourite, but is that kind of below him now?
I'll be very surprised if he goes there. It's difficult to say, like you mentioned there about all of the defensive problems they've had. They've conceded 24 goals since the start of last season, which is ridiculous. From set pieces. Yeah, I think they need somebody who's really going to start from, from foundations and build literally from, defense through to attack. I think need to sort out defensive problems because I think they're undoing all of their own good work. Like Myles was just saying there, they're really easy on the eye to watch, going forward. Attacking wise, they've got some really talented players. I think it doesn't help that I think over the last couple of years, especially, if you look at some of the long-term injuries they've had, there have been all throughout their defence. There's been a time when Pereira's been out, James Justin's been out, a couple of the centre-backs, Fofana obviously had a really long-term injury as well. So they've not really had a set back four, so to speak. It seems like it's been so interchangeable that there's not really been any sort of gelling being able to happen. And then you take Schmeichel out of that team, who was obviously a really big character in a part of keeping that defence together, that now it's, they're in a real mess and it's quite worrying, really.
I think there is an obvious candidate, though, isn't there? Yeah. I think Pochettino, is with the financial constraint that Leicester find themselves in the summer, sacking Rodgers and then the kind of money it would take to bring Pochettino in, and he's only going to want to come in if there's transfer funds available. That won't happen. If you're looking for a team that needs to sort their defence out and bring in someone with Premier League experience, well, I think we will see Sean Dyche end up at Leicester, surely. I think that's probably the appointment that makes the most sense for them in terms of practical value right now, but will not be one that necessarily gets the fans too excited, sadly. Maybe that would work. We've never seen Dyche at that sort of club, at that sort of level, but he's organised. It might do what it needs to for Leicester.
Well, he's had to deal with the financial realities of Burnley's budget in the past. Maybe with a bit more of an elevated budget, he'll go for a different kind of player, different kind of system. Who knows? But I think you're right in terms of fighting the fire that's raging at the minute and stopping them from sliding into the Championship. It's got to be Dyche, hasn't it? No other manager is willing, I don't think, to have a relegation fight this season. That is the level that they need. And I don't think any is kind of capable, really, to dig them out of the mire. Sean Dyche has been there, hasn't he?
I think what you mentioned there, obviously, they've got to be realistic in who they can attract, because there's certain things, really, that are probably pushing away managers from that job at the minute. I mean, would Dean Smith be a good shout to go to Leicester?
No, he's coming back to Villa. Leave him alone.
Still hold out hope there, Myles, right?
Do you know what? We watched the game on Friday and I turned to Naya straight away and I said to her, I just hope that after this game, the board get on the phone to Norwich, give them whatever compensation they need and say, we made a huge mistake. Can you come and sort this out for us?
Blimey.
Anyway, Leicester, right?
In terms of, I was going to talk about Spurs next, because on paper, they've had a really solid start to the season. Obviously, right at the top of the Premier League for a good reason. I don't think they've actually played their best football yet. I don't think they've been amazing, And even against Leicester, they were just very lucky to come up against a really flimsy defence, weren't they? But an emphatic win nonetheless. They'll be absolutely thrilled with the way they're going at the moment. Son comes off the bench and produces a really incredible performance with some brilliant goals as well, weren't they? A few blockbusters in there. So how do you rate Spurs' chances this season, Myles? Having seen them close up now for a good few games, are they looking like they could compete at the top still? Because you had high hopes, didn't you?
Yeah, and I do think over the course of the season, their squad is so strong. There's a couple of gaps that probably need addressing, but Conte is the guy to do it. And I think his management of Son in this game was absolutely perfect. It was a bit of a reality check. All right, you won't start. And then look at his response. It was just absolutely fantastic. His first goal was outstanding. He matched it with the second, with different feet as well, right? Which is just the capability of a player to be able to do that. And then he was hungry for that third. You could see that he was really motivated. Now, it's not the best we've seen Spurs play this season, but if they're going to score 6 in a game when they're not playing their best, that's pretty good going. Bentancur getting a goal as well will help from the midfield. That's something they need to work on. And off the back of a really poor result in Europe, and not the most glamorous football, it's what Conte does. It's efficient. And Leicester were probably the perfect opponent for them this weekend. And they wouldn't have wanted to go 1-0 down, and they wouldn't have wanted to let Leicester back in at 2-2. But then when it came to the right time, they finished them off. And that's the depth that Spurs have got. They can bring Son off the bench. It's brilliant. I think they'll be really strong this season. And once they click a little bit more in that midfield in particular, then there's no stopping where they could get to, bar Man City.
Well, at the minute they're keeping pace with City, but then so are Arsenal. We've seen Arsenal get turned over by Manchester United. We've seen a few results where it's challenged these teams, but City seems to be the ones that are actually steamrollering so far. So they say it's early days. You shouldn't look at the Premier League table too early. But what are we, sort of 6-7 games in now? I think it's a fair reflection of where the teams are. You have got sort of City, Spurs, and Arsenal competing at the top. United on the fringes. Brighton is still up there for how long? Nobody knows. Sorry,
Fulham are 6th, right?
Fulham as well, yeah. So there's a few anomalies up there, but there's a few of the usual suspects. The gap is a point at the minute. I think it is. It's very small margins. Liverpool haven't hit form yet. Chelsea, we don't know how they're going to fare. So it seems quite wide open. So I think if we're going to get a clear picture of it, we'll find out in the next few games, surely. I think the next 3 or 4 games will really paint a good picture of title credentials. But Spurs are looking all right. I think they've got it in them to go up another gear as well.
Particularly when you've got the North London derby coming after the international break. That'll be a massive picture of where those two teams are at. Because really, we talked about it last week, Arsenal haven't faced anyone that you would imagine that they would come under some sort of trouble with other than Man United, and they lost. Man City have had a few interesting results, but look like they're clicking now. So it's early days, and Spurs will take a lot of heart from getting not just a win here, but 6 goals, and getting Son off the mark makes a big difference for them. But there's still a few creases to be ironed out within this Spurs team. And had they come against a different side this weekend, Leicester were the better team at times. I know it sounds mad to say, but if you look at all the possession stats, Leicester were much higher. They had more attempts on goal. They were bright going forward, but they just gave it away in silly moments.
That scoreline flattered Tottenham
massively.
Obviously, Leicester, the first 2 goals they conceded were just complete gifts, and they let Spurs back into that game. It's been the case, the last couple of games they've gone ahead, haven't they? Aside from the United game, I think the game before they went ahead 1-0 and literally, lost the lead quite quickly. That it's just, they're really struggling, and I'm just curious to see where this Spurs team. I think their clear weakness for me is in that midfield. I just don't think they're good enough in midfield to control games at the minute, and it's showing. But I feel like this Arsenal game could be tailor-made for them. If they look at how United approached that Arsenal game, I think if they approach similar, they could literally tear Arsenal apart.
Spurs just want to counter-attack constantly, don't they? And having the kind of forwards that they do, even if Kane isn't the quickest, the rest of them are, and they will pick you apart. It's interesting to see a team set up so much for a counter-attack when their midfield lacks so much creativity. But even Højbjerg seems to be looking for a creative pass more often than you would imagine he would. And Perisic has settled in really, really quickly. The other weakness is obviously Davinson Sanchez. That challenge for Leicester's penalty was an absolute calamity. And he's been that for a while now. And considering the promise that he had when he was at Ajax and the money that Spurs spent on him, Conte must be watching that and pulling his hair plugs out, surely.
Yeah, we'll see what the January transfer window brings for him then, eh? I think that's probably one of the areas he'll highlight, I think.
I would think so.
Moving on to Arsenal. So Thomas Frank said of Brentford's performance in this game, although they lost 3-0, he didn't feel like they played any better or worse than any other game they've played this season. It's just that Arsenal that much better. And he obviously includes the United win in that. They beat them 4-0 with the same sort of level. So he thinks the consistency is there for Brentford. But Arsenal were really good, weren't they? I thought the performance against Brentford really sort of earmarked how clinical they are now, how minimal fuss they deal with their going through the gears and attacking and creating chances. What do you think, Myles, to this Arsenal? They seem to be maturing almost, don't they, I think, as the season goes on?
Yeah, the word for it, I think, is solid, because that's just something we haven't seen from Arsenal for a really long time, but they just looked solid. And that's really encouraging. I actually disagree with Thomas Frank, and I think he was trying to take some of the pressure off his players. I thought it was the worst I've seen Brentford, but maybe that's because Arsenal made them look that way. They were very clinical. And there are two players that I think worth pointing out, and obviously they both got goals, which helps. But I think the confidence that Jesus has is starting to almost be infectious in that team. You would have said about Arsenal in the past when they play teams like Brentford that they almost seemed like, even though they were the biggest side, they lacked the confidence needed to just finish the game off. Whereas Jesus is so confident on the ball that other players seem to feed off it and know if I give him the ball, he will try and make something happen. And I think that's really good. And then at the other side of the pitch, Saliba's presence is just brilliant, isn't he? He looks so good. And it's the player that Arsenal were promised when they signed him. And it took a couple of years, but it's very easy to look at how good he is and how quickly he's settled and gone, well, why didn't Arteta bring him in sooner? But actually, those 2 years in France have clearly been instrumental in his development. And he's settled in so well now. The goal was hilarious. He definitely didn't mean it. It come off the top of his head. It was terrible technique. But what he brings at the back is so crucial for Arsenal right now that, it's that spine of the team is just so improved. And I include Granit Xhaka in that too, because he's been brilliant this season.
Yeah, Arsenal have had a lot of changes over the last couple of years, incremental, mind you. I mean, last summer they changed a lot of players, didn't they? And had a wobbly start, but came good in the end. This season they've started kind of integrating players like William Saliba. And I thought he played really well. They even chucked on a 15-year-old at one point, didn't they? They were that confident.
Yeah, we need to talk about that. What do you think of that?
It's a statement, isn't it? It's a statement that they're comfortable enough to be able to give a young lad a debut. But it's a heck of a lot of pressure to be carried on his shoulders now, isn't it, for that age? It's mad.
Apparently, clubs looking to sign him. Apparently, City, Arsenal, United and Liverpool are all after it. And I don't know whether Arsenal is probably a bit... It's partly they're trying to convince him probably to stay, like saying, look, we can give you some minutes. But also, if he does leave, it will mean that they get probably a good compensation package. To say that he's obviously already made his Premier League debut.
If that is the case, I think that furthers what I'm about to say. And forgive me if I'm looking into this too deep. I find it morally wrong. He's 15. He's a child. Like, this is someone who he hasn't even finished growing yet. And they're putting him on a professional football pitch among big, strong athletes. Look at some of the things that happened in the Premier League over the last season or two. This weekend, look at that challenge Nathan Collins puts in on Jack Grealish. If you do that to a 15-year-old, I can't understand how he belongs in that environment at that sort of age. I don't see who it's good for, because all it does really is it puts massive pressure on him now, because everyone will know him as if you are the youngest player in Premier League history, people are expecting you to be a world beater now. And if you don't live up to that, then you've got hype around you immediately. That's poor. You also risk the idea of physicality at a very young age, which could set him back a long way. And it's just, he couldn't work in any of our work environments. He's 15. He's not an adult, but he's playing professional sport alongside him. I just think it's too much.
I disagree with the physicality side of it, because, I mean, we've got football players in the Premier League that are really slight, really small, really, delicately balanced, and it doesn't take much to knock them off the ball. I can't see the difference between him and a 15-year-old and any of those.
They're fully developed. That's their body. Do you know what I mean? It's a 15-year-old. What were you doing when you were 15? You wouldn't want to be competing at that sort of level, surely. What's the opposing player supposed to do? If that kid's running at you, are you going to put a challenge in on him? Or are you going to think he's 15? There are players that will be playing in the Premier League right now will have kids his age. He's 6 years younger than Bukayo Saka. And we think of Saka as someone who's still coming through as a kid now. Like that, I just think it's mental to put a child in a Premier League game. If you're Virgil van Dijk and that kid starts running at you, what do? You snap him? I don't know. I get
your point. Yeah, but I mean, The fact remains he's kind of undercut the youngest age now by some way, I think. He's only 15 years and 100 or something days old. So he's only just 15, really, which is another crazy thing to think. He was only 14 a few months ago.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, it is.
All it was there to do was to build a media circus around it. And also, what do you tell anyone else on the fringes of your squad if you're picking a 15-year-old ahead of them? If you're someone like Reece Nelson who's trying to come through at Arsenal, for example, and you're going, all right, you're done with us now then, because we already have moved on to a 15-year-old. I just think it's bizarre. Do
you know what? When you put it like that, the fact that he was even on the bench anyway is a bit odd, isn't it? Because they had more senior players at their disposal that they chose not to put on. So yeah, a strange move by Arteta. But moving on to Arsenal's actual senior players, I thought some of their newest signings, like you said, Gabriel Jesus looked great. It was Fabio Vieira's first proper start, wasn't it? As well, in an Arsenal shirt. He scored a fantastic goal as well, and he looked really impressive too. Their midfield looks so much stronger with him in it already.
To be fair, he looks smaller than that 15-year-old as well. But yeah, he looks a really classy player. Everyone's kind of compared him early to Bernardo Silva, and seeing that moment of magic from him early in his Arsenal career, again, it's a great sign. The development of this Arsenal team is amazing. But I think in their next 5 or 6 fixtures, they've now got to play Spurs, Liverpool, Chelsea, and City, I think. That's the test. And in the middle of all that, they've obviously got their European football as well. So we'll measure Arsenal after those games, maybe, but you have to give them credit for what they've done so far. The same as last season, we were measuring them after 3 games that they'd lost at the start of the season, 2 of which being City and Chelsea. I think it's only fair that you look at how they are across the whole picture. And so far, so good, but we'll see when it gets hard, I guess.
Or maybe with those games coming up, they'll have to lean more on 15-year-old Ethan Nwaneri in the future. Who knows? He might get more games than you realise.
Yeah.
Moving on to City as well, who beat Wolves 3-0. Another impressive result for them. I know we say this a lot, we can blow it out of proportion. And we did, I think, last season when City seemed to be streaking ahead. It's game over pretty much for the title. And then it just falls every now and again. You know, teams have blips. I can see City having a blip at some point, but right now they look pretty irresistible, Dave, don't they? They don't look like losing.
No, and obviously it helps when you go 1-0 ahead in the first couple of minutes of game. And let's be honest, it's not very often that City lose a game when they go ahead. So yeah, they just, they're making it look really easy at the moment. And I know everyone was jumping on the bandwagon in terms of Jack Grealish, all the criticism that he received over the last few weeks, and we made the perfect response with his goal, and I think probably one of his better performances so far for City, and that's good, encouraging to see, especially as an England fan as well, because I think a lot of England fans at the minute are getting a bit worried with how many players aren't quite on form. So hopefully he'll kick on from here. But yeah, I mean, a performance really. It was professional, wasn't it? Once they got to 3-0, that was it really. They kind of went into third gear and literally just played it out. And again, Erling Haaland on the score sheet. It's just ridiculous to think how many goals he could score this season.
Well, Haaland as well as De Bruyne with 2 assists. De Bruyne looks fantastic at the minute as well. But on Grealish, Myles, as well, you've followed his career quite closely, and he's coming for some stick, and I think rightly so. He's been a bit anonymous the last few times he's played for City. He's been on the fringes quite a lot. He hasn't looked his normal attacking, creative self at all. He took a really difficult blow, didn't he, from Nathan Collins, who got a red card rightly in the first half as well. But yeah, a great Grealish performance. And like Dave said, probably one of his best so far in a City shirt.
Yeah, it was. And it's so funny. All the fickle Villa fans that were booing him at Villa Park after the Dortmund game were back on Twitter going, we should put a bid in January. Let's bring him home. We could get him back. And look, we've said from day one about this move that it didn't necessarily seem the most logical for his playing style to move to Man City. It was always going to take an adjustment. This game seemed more like Grealish because he was playing with that kind of freedom, that ability to take a player on, draw the foul and do what he needed to do. And that's his skill. That's what he always did well at Villa. Teams didn't know how to defend him when he was running at them. And too often for City, he feels too conservative and comes back to the fullback, who granted is João Cancelo, who is a fantastic footballer and a great provider and can cross. So it's a good option to go back to him, but it's very safe. So it's not a surprise that Grealish isn't lighting up the stage and being the name that everyone sees. I don't think he's been as bad as people say he is. His numbers necessarily don't reflect what you would expect of someone that you spend £100 million on. But this Man City team is not someone that are going to indulge Grealish very often. So it was nice for him to get a good performance. That Nathan Collins challenge, I mentioned it earlier, but was absolutely ridiculous.
Disgusting.
And he even tried to turn to the ref and said, yeah, but I was watching the ball the whole way. He jumped with both feet in the air and caught him above his waist. There is no justification for a challenge like that. And that really upset Wolves, because as good as City were and professional as they were, there were moments where Wolves looked threatening, and had it stayed at 11v11, they would have lost still, but they were in the game a lot more. It was it was an interesting performance, and I think Arsenal fans will probably be mad at us and the whole football world for saying, oh, no one looks like they can stop City right now when Arsenal are top of the league. But City do look like they're ready to kick on from now. It's interesting. I don't know where I see Arsenal and City kind of comparatively right now.
I'm trying to think of where you can see City potentially tripping up. And it's difficult, isn't it? But we know they can. But, I mean, what kind of team can you see them losing points against? You say they already have. But, I mean, what does it take tactically to set up against City and take something from them?
That's the hardest thing about City now, particularly with Haaland. They've got so many attacking dimensions that it's hard to set up against them, because you think when you have players like Foden and Grealish, you want to be constantly applying pressure out wide and getting your centre-backs to support as your fullback attacks them. But then you just leave acres of space for Haaland, and he exploited that in this game. His goal was fantastic. He waited for the run of the centre-back to almost block the vision of the keeper and then slotted it home. He's so intelligent, and that's just another dimension. And if you try and press them and the wingers, then they just lay the ball back to the fullback, and then they've got that aerial presence now. So there's so many dimensions to City's attack. I don't really know how to stop them in that manner. The only thing I can think is if you try and take your game to them. So actually, you might see a team like Arsenal, who are very good on the ball and can pass a lot stronger than a lot of the other teams that City have faced so far this season, have a bit more joy. If Arsenal try and play their football, it'll either mean they get beaten 8-0 or they'll win. I don't think there's a middle ground, because they're essentially trying to do to City what City will do to them. And if you can be better on your day and get your decision making right, that might be the only option. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, I think you can see if they get frustrated enough, I could see them losing a bit of rhythm. And they've often struggled when they've had frustrations in the past, but they haven't had Erling Haaland in the past, have they? I think he feels like a bit of a game changer. He seems like a galvanizing influence on the team as well. He's really motivated, isn't he? He's a fun character to have around the team, I think, as well. When you see his post-match interviews, he always seems like he's got his tongue firmly in his cheek and is trying to have a bit of fun with the interviewers as well. So he seems like a character. And I think that they've seemed a bit stale at times, City, in terms of character. They seem very like robotic and mechanical, but he has a bit of an edge to them, I think. Dave, what's your take on City's potential prospects this season? And I mean, how can anyone disrupt or stop their rhythm?
I think that's the thing there you mentioned, that when again they seem to be having one of those days where they can't get the ball in the net. It feels like they've already got that plan B there, starting, up front for them. And once they get, like we're mentioning, once they go ahead now, it seems it's always going to be hard to turn a result around. And that's the thing for me. I think if teams are going to be clever about it when they come up against City, I think managers just need to be a bit more pragmatic, and it's about which managers have the capability to do that. We saw Arteta against United made that ridiculous treble substitution at the point where it was on a knife edge, the game, and it was quite naive. So I think if you're looking at it as a manager, I think especially the likes of Arteta, you probably got to just accept, look, the City team is even as good as we've been this season, they're far better. They're a different animal. And you've got to look at ways of getting a result from a game maybe playing in a different manner to what you have been playing for the whole season. You're not going to dominate that Man City team. Not going to happen. But what Arsenal do have is they have pace, and they can hurt you on the attack. And we've seen City concede goals on the break a few times this season.
True.
So
I'll tell you what, we talk about it's going to take a really good manager and City looking unstoppable, but it's easy to forget that City drew with Villa in their last game, and Steven Gerrard's under a lot of pressure. They've drawn with Newcastle already this season, who have only won once this season. So it is doable. It is more doable than I think people are giving City kind of too much credit in some ways, because Haaland has been so clinical, and when they have won, they've dispatched teams well. But I think watching that Villa game last week, for example, Watkins was able to bully their defence. He either put himself on the fullbacks, who are so good going forward, but Cancelo isn't the strongest defensively. So if you target him, that's doable, just as teams do to Trent, for example. And I think if you look at Newcastle, St. Maximin got so much joy against Kyle Walker because it was quick wingers, wide players who are going to be a bit more physical and will put some pressure on you. So there are plenty of teams in the league that have players like that. And I think Arsenal, for example, they'll really rely on how well Martinelli and Saka get into that game, for example. And that'll be a really interesting kind of one-on-one battle that we'll see. So yes, City look brilliant, but there have been a couple of times already this season where they haven't. And can you say the same about Arsenal? Against Man United, there were moments in that game that lost them the game. But actually, they were probably the better side for the majority of it. And had things gone a different way, they would have won that. So I do think we're very quick to say City look unstoppable, Arsenal will drop off. And actually, two teams have come pretty close to stopping City already that are not the best teams in the league by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, you're giving everyone in the Premier League a bit of hope there, mate. Thank you for that. But I do think every team that does get anything against them has to be defensively excellent on the day. I think Villa were, to be fair. They looked really solid. I think Newcastle were as well. But I think that's the thing. You have to be defensively 100%. No chinks in the armour, no room for error. And then you can attack with confidence because you've stopped a really difficult City team from scoring. So, if any team is going to get any result against them, they've got to be on it, haven't they? Speaking of defensively on it, that wasn't the case at the City ground. Forest lost to Fulham 3-2 in quite a cavalier end-to-end game. Fulham look pretty impressive, though. They are making a claim, I think, to actually avoid relegation this season. In fact, it feels ridiculous to say that they might be considered relegation candidates because they've looked competitive, Dave, haven't they, really? Every game they've played, they've really got up amongst it and fought for their points. Yeah,
and I think one thing you can look at as well is in these games where they're coming up against some of the teams that are around the bottom of the table, they're beating them, which are obviously really key fixtures. They're the games that really you've got to win. You've got to beat the smaller teams, and then anything you get against the bigger teams in the league is obviously a bonus. So, I mean, it was an interesting game. One thing I've got to highlight is Dean Henderson's performance. I thought he had a pretty shocking game. There's a couple of goals in there, especially positioning for the last goal. You look at when the player took the shot, he was literally at his near post, probably 3 feet away from his near post. There's a gaping hole, and the shot wasn't even right in the corner. He's given himself like a mammoth task there to even get anywhere near the finish.
Is that the one where after he conceded it, he turned into Randy Orton preparing for the RKO? Please put that video in.
A lot of people saying, he's turned into a WWE ref and he starts the count as well.
I loved it.
I mean, his comments the other week have backfired a little bit. It's gone from him being, England's number one to the last couple of weeks. He's had a couple of, contentious attempted saves, goals that have been scored against him, which you probably expect him to do a lot better with. But on the whole, like you mentioned there, Fulham have been really impressive. A number of their players. Palhinha looks like he's going to be the bar of the season for me.
Yeah. Great goal as well.
He was a big, he's always been known as a big talent. Over in Portugal, I think it was just one of those big ifs if he can do it in a better league, and he's looking so good. So I'm sure Fulham fans are over the moon with him.
And Willian getting an assist, hilarious.
Rolling back the years. How do you rate Fulham's chances, Myles? Do you think they're comfortably mid-table? Are there many teams better, worse than them, do you think?
Yeah, there are. And I think that's the really worrying thing for teams like West Ham, teams like Leicester, Southampton. You could probably draw Villa and Everton into it as well. That really those teams that expect to do well in the Premier League are watching the newly promoted sides pick up points.
Yeah.
And that's worrying. Even Bournemouth got a point this weekend. Forest, I think we all kind of had a bit of hope for Forest at the start of the season and a bit of optimism because it was quite exciting to see them back. They look in the most trouble to me because they signed 25 players. And look, I understand that they had to. I know Forest fans will say, oh, yeah, but we only had 2 senior players. I completely understand it. It doesn't make it any easier for them to gel, though. And that defensive performance, I think, shows where the fault is. Fulham look like the business that they've done has been really smart. They've improved the spine of that team and brought in some Premier League experience. Leno's a fantastic keeper. Mitrovic looks a different player under Marco Silva than we've seen him in the Premier League before. And I think that's another big difference. Silva is a very good coach. He's a bit mental. And I think in his last 4 jobs, we would talk about how he had his eye on the next one. But this seems to be a really good fit right now.
Yeah,
and it seems to be really successful. And I think Fulham will be quite comfortably safe if they can continue the form that they've shown so far. Then who knows where they'll push to. It's really encouraging for Fulham fans because they'll probably be sick of that up and down, up and down, up and down. They look like now they go into a Premier League game at the weekend, not expecting to lose, but okay, what kind of performance are we going to put in? What kind of result are we going to get? And it's good football too. It's
Absolutely.
not just defending our way to safety. They look really good for them. I've enjoyed watching them.
Elsewhere in the Premier League as well, Villa beat Southampton 1-0. Quickly on that one, Myles, do you still Gerrard out?
Yeah, terrible performance, but we'll take a win. Southampton are awful, by the way. Southampton, honestly, they've signed a lot of very young players, and it was a really young side, but they looked absolutely terrible. Villa didn't have to do anything to win that game.
No. Well, that says a lot. It was one of the poorest games of the weekend, I think, for quality, wasn't it? The goal
It was
itself.
one of the poorest games I've ever seen. Never mind of the weekend. It was awful.
Newcastle won, Bournemouth won as well. Like you say, Bournemouth snatching a point there. Dave, you got any concerns about Newcastle? We were saying before we recorded, they've not looked amazing this season, have they?
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because it's such a fickle game. Because, a few weeks ago when they had that result against Man City, we were all saying, oh, you know what? They're looking like a team now. And yeah, the last few weeks, it's kind of been turned on its head and they've struggled to create chances. Isak's looked like a really good signing for them, but even he's not been able to win them games. I just think they're struggling to create. And like we mentioned, the key players that they have, like, for instance, St. Maximin, if he's not, that's the only thing I said to you about the other week, Mike, is he has so much potential to, be a difference maker and obviously be a game changer, but it's just the final ball. It always is with him. He from game to game, he just changes. It looks like, he can literally take a whole team on 1 week, and then the next week he looks like he's not kicked a ball in 6 months. So I don't fear for them. I don't think they'll be in any trouble. I think there's a lot of other teams in the league that are, far more should be far more worried than them. But they're going for a bit of an indifferent spell where they're just drawing too many games for me. They're not losing too many, but they need some wins. They can't just be going along grabbing the odd point here and there, especially against the teams where they should really be getting results.
The thing with Newcastle is you say that they won't be in any trouble, and I completely agree. They're not really going to be threatened by relegation, but where is their expectation this season? They might not be in trouble, but they could fall very short of what they want, and that could leave Eddie Howe in trouble. I don't remember a season where we were 7 games in and it felt like so many managers were under intense pressure. We've already seen 2 go with Parker and Tuchel. We've talked constantly about Lampard and Gerrard. We imagine Rodgers will go this week. Eddie Howe's only won 1 game. Southampton are terrible. I said last week I'm pretty confident David Moyes will be gone by the end of the season, and they lost again this weekend. Nottingham Forest have had a new manager every single year, and they've only got 4 points. Wolves have only got 6 points. All of a sudden, I've got 8 managers that I can think of that really might lose their job in the next few weeks if things don't change. And we're not even 10 games into the season. I don't remember it ever being like that.
The funny thing is, the other week we were saying who's going to be the first manager to be sacked, and we both said either Gerrard or Lampard, and it's both the first two managers have not been either one of them.
Exactly. And it's so funny because all of those clubs that I just mentioned seem like they're in crisis, but Everton and Villa are 3 points off Chelsea, who are 7th. They're 4 points off Fulham, who are in the top 6 all of a sudden. So the league, the quality in the league doesn't seem like it's very separated like it was last year. Instead, it seems very competitive, but I can't work out if that's a good thing or not.
I feel like there's so many teams that are in transition still. You know, they're in flux. Yeah. They've not got a settled 11 even. They've not got a manager that's been there long enough. And that's weird. You know, there's normally been Premier League managers who have got 4 or 5 years experience. They've all gone, you know. There's nobody really apart from maybe Pep and Klopp who have got an Arteta now. We've got really more than a few years.
And Arteta has had time to develop that team. And the rest of the league look like they're chasing shadows at the moment. It's weird.
Yeah, it is. On that note as well, with you mentioned Lampard, he got his much-needed win against West Ham, didn't he, this weekend? He's still Lampard out. Do you think he's turning it around? They did show signs of positive play, actually, Everton, didn't they? And I thought the goal from Neil Maupay as well, which was a rarity, was well taken.
It's Maupay! Yes!
So funny. The commentator said, that is so typical Maupay. And I was thinking, no, it isn't. It's completely the opposite. I've never seen him do that. No, Everton did look better and they looked defensively a lot stronger, but West Ham looked weak, and they have done all season, really. They've got a couple of wins in Europe, but even they weren't very favourable when you consider the opposition they were facing. I really worry about West Ham and David Moyes. And I think Lampard... It seems like he's trying to be more organised and he's trying to get some sort of system in. Their recruitment in the summer, we questioned it, but there's a few players that have settled in really well. Connor Cody looks great. So, yeah, maybe we can see him turn a corner. It depends on what Everton want to do. If they're just talking about avoiding relegation, they can probably stick with Lampard for the season and maybe they'll be okay. If that's their level now, cool. If they want to do anything more, Lampard's not good enough to get them there. So it's 1 win in 7 games. I don't think we can get too carried away with it yet.
I think what we're finding out as well is there's not that many good coaches around, because you look at Lampard and go, if he went, who would take his spot? And we've said the same with Rodgers. There's just the dearth of quality in coaches, isn't there?
But there is also that gap in jobs too. And that kind of means that people like Pochettino all of a sudden come on the market for clubs at a slightly lower. I was having this conversation the other day, actually, about who would I want at Villa if Gerrard went. And I imagine Everton fans would feel very similar about Lampard. Conte went to Tottenham because those elite jobs didn't really seem like they were coming up. And that was the time where he thought, I've got to get back into the game now to keep my stock high. Pochettino will go through the same thing, but is at a lower level than Conte. So all of a sudden, clubs like Leicester, Everton, Villa might have a punt at a manager that otherwise they would not. It looks like Allegri will leave Juventus soon, and you imagine that takes Tuchel off the market. But all of a sudden, you've got these coaches that are probably too good for the clubs that are available. Zidane's still not got a job. Tuchel's out of work. Pochettino's out of work. They've got to go somewhere.
Khan has been terrible this season.
Yeah, Khan came out yesterday, didn't he, and said that they'll give Nagelsmann more time, but that's the dreaded vote of confidence, isn't it? And when you say terrible, I think they only lost their first game this weekend. It's just terrible by Bayern standards, which is a funny thing.
I think they've drawn 2 or 3, though.
Yeah, they have.
Sadio Mane not really looked the player he was at Liverpool either.
Well, obviously, they beat Barca, didn't they, last week? And that will be a massive result for them because Barca really pushed for that one. And that would have been a bit of a grudge match almost. And they still came out on top. Any team that loses someone like Lewandowski and doesn't really bring in a number 9 is going to go through that adjustment period. And I do think that if they trust Nagelsmann, Bayern will be absolutely fine. I still have them as probably top 3 favourites for the Champions League. I just think it's early days in the season. It's too soon for them to react. Whereas Juventus look genuinely terrible and probably should make a change.
Yeah, they do. Really bad. On the note of coaches, Myles, Roberto De Zerbi going to Brighton. What do you reckon of that appointment in particular? Looks pretty astute for them, doesn't it?
It's a hard one to call because we obviously never seen it at this sort of level. Sassuolo is probably the closest thing you can say to Brighton, because Shakhtar, obviously, it's a delicate situation there currently, and they're also expected to dominate their league.
Yeah.
Decent coach in terms of attacking philosophy, which is something that Potter took some time to build up. And I think it's hard to replace a manager that you haven't sacked, because you're never expecting for that next appointment. Whereas someone like Villa have probably been looking for their next manager whilst Gerrard's still in the job. So they've had to react quickly, and they've done it. And this is a person that supposedly was being lined up by Juventus, although that might just be his agent talking. So we'll see. None of us are going to sit here and pretend to be massive experts on his coaching style. I've seen him at Sassuolo very briefly, but wouldn't remember him incredibly well. But from what I've seen and read, the philosophy is very much the same as Potter's. He wants to develop good footballing habits and play forward with the front foot. And maybe Brighton are in a better position to start like that than they were when Potter got there. So we'll see what they can do. But I think we'll see a bit of a drop-off, if I'm totally honest.
Yeah. Okay, away from the Premier League then, looking at the England squad, we're going to have to look at this increasingly over the next few weeks, aren't we, and months as we get closer to the World Cup. But what an interesting squad selection, it's fair to say. It's the last one he's had before he actually goes to the World Cup and picks his squad, Gareth Southgate. And he's picked Luke Shaw and Harry Maguire. He's left out Jadon Sancho and Marcus Rashford. So a lot of Manchester United heavy things to talk through, Dave. So I'll start with you. What is he thinking? Because we know that Southgate's a very loyal manager, isn't he? But what's the thinking behind these omissions and inclusions?
I think there's a number of players that you can talk about that have come in. There's 6 or 7 that you can argue about why they've been included in the squad, mainly due to lack of football, not really been playing very well for their clubs. Jarrod Bowen, for instance, has not looked anywhere near his the sort of form he was producing last season. So you've got that's got to be questioned for me, especially when you've got the likes of Jadon Sancho, who's actually started the season really well, and looks like more of the player that we thought we were buying, obviously from Dortmund the year before. And I just think there's some strange, questionable decisions in there, especially from a man who obviously did say himself, I'll go by the form of the player who's playing well, and evidently that's not the case, is it, when you look at the players that he selected.
This close to the World Cup, Myles, surely he's got a pretty settled squad in mind. So does this give us a glimpse into what that squad might be? And if so, how are you feeling about it?
It's hard because there's a few injuries as well that he's missing some players that would definitely be in there. Jordan Pickford's not there, obviously. Jordan Henderson's not there, and I imagine he will get his way back in. I don't know. I'm glad to see Ivan Toney in there. I think that's well deserved, although I'd still have Tammy Abraham as my first choice back up to Harry Kane. It's an interesting squad, and I think Dave hit the nail on the head when he talked about loyalty. Eric Dyer's back. That's someone that Southgate knows. Maguire is someone that's never let him down for England. So you understand why they'd be there. But how important is it going to be if they get to the World Cup and they've not been playing for their club side and they're just not at the right pace for it? There's a few players that I think should have probably got a look in. Jadon Sancho, obviously, is the first one you consider. Is it too soon to be looking at Marcus Edwards at Sporting? After his performance in the Champions League in the last two match weeks, he looks fantastic. And if you're going to get Jarrod Bowen in there, who, as Dave says, has started the season quite poorly, maybe we could have looked at some alternatives. This is his last chance to experiment, and actually he's gone really safe. He's picked 4 right backs again.
That epitomises his whole reign,
it's difficult, though, isn't it? Because if you go too risky, these aren't friendlies, remember. This is the Nations League, where they did not start the Nations League well. They have to win these games that they've got coming up, and they've got Italy and Germany. So you throw in players that you've never seen there or haven't been at the last couple of camps, and it goes wrong. Southgate goes into a World Cup having been relegated from his Nations League group, and that doesn't look good. True. Or he plays it safe, and fans are angry that he's picked quite boring picks. I am very pro Gareth Southgate. I feel like increasingly England fans become less and less that. And I feel like that's just the fickle nature of football, where because it's not winning 8-0 against Germany every week, then you have to want him out. And it's all coincidence that we've done as well as we have. We should have won the Euros. No, He's managed this squad very well in the past. He's brought in a great philosophy, a great atmosphere in an England camp that we've not seen for years. You've got to trust him. I do think some of the selections are very odd, but
I think
he knows better than I do. I genuinely believe that. And I know that's a weird comment for someone to have when we're on a football podcast where we criticize or praise managers every week. Yeah. But I don't know. I'm going to trust Southgate on this one.
Do you think it was more of an opportunity to try some more untested players? You mentioned the likes of Marcus Edwards there, who I fully agree with you. I think he looks, fantastic player. But do you think it would have been better to keep, because he's looking obviously these games now. These are the last games that England play. Obviously, the rest of the national teams as well will play until the World Cup comes around. Do you think it would have been better to bring 2 or 3 players in that he thought, do you know what, actually, these could be a wild card pick for us? They could actually come in and, like the likes of Marcus Edwards, rather than, we speak about, obviously you mentioned Jarrod Bowen there. He's obviously got in the last couple of squads he's been in?
Yeah.
I imagine now he kind of knows what he's going to offer to him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he knows what he's getting, but do you really want to see what someone else can offer? Whether they could potentially be a better pick?
I agree. There's too much safe there, isn't there, in the squad? I am pleased that he's put Tony in. I think that's on merit. I'm pleased he's put Tomori in again. Absolutely on merit and long overdue for both players, really. But you're right. I think 1 or 2... Let's see how they get on. Wild card kind of picks wouldn't have been too big a gamble.
I think those 2 that you've just named will be those picks where he wants to really have a look at them, and Bellingham. I know Bellingham is in all the squads, but he doesn't start all the games. I imagine Bellingham will start both of these games because he has to be of the mindset now of he is my starting midfielder, but he's not done that often enough for England yet. So I look at this and think, this is Southgate forming his final squad and working out his best 11. And if you want to work out your best 11, I don't know if 2 games before the World Cup is the time to start trying people and testing people. Because we've talked before about one of the things that you praise Southgate for is he almost treats England like a club side. And that has developed this understanding and this fluidity between them and this good atmosphere within the camp that a lot of international teams that pick 10 different players each squad never develop. So actually, maybe we view it as safe because it's the same old names, but actually it's just smart and it's pragmatic and going, do you know what? I've had time to get my philosophy onto these players. I'm going to stick with them. I have scope to look at a couple of new signings, let's call them, in Ivan Toney, Tomori, maybe. Still Jarrod Bowen to an extent, because we've not seen a great deal of him at England. But with the wide players England have, he's not going to start at the World Cup. You don't need to worry about him, really. So maybe he's just there because it's familiar and he's good to train with. Who knows? I'm not worried about it. England need to win these 2 games, definitely. And particularly off the back of the last few results, Southgate will feel a bit of pressure if he loses them. So I don't blame him for being safe.
I think Bellingham will start because he doesn't have his safe duo of Phillips and Rice anymore.
Rice will be there, but Henderson's out as well, isn't he?
I think we've needed that, though, to make sure players like Henderson are forcibly removed from the squad. I mean, he's a great player on his day, but I do think he's past his best. And I think Liverpool haven't been amazing in midfield this season anyway. But yeah, Bellingham's been great. And I think now's his time, I think we could lean on him for the next 10 years. He's one of those players that could dominate. But very much kind of trust in Southgate, I think, aren't we? We've got to.
The only thing that I'm genuinely disappointed by is that we've still got the 4 right backs.
Yeah.
Because look, they're all fantastic right backs. We know that. You have to narrow it down now. It's a waste having 4 in the squad. You don't need that. And all of a sudden now our centre back options look really limited. We've got Stones, Tomori, Cody, Maguire, and Mark Gahey. Are you thrilled by any of them? Really? Tomori, I am. John Stones. I think those 2 start. They have to start.
Yeah, definitely.
Cody, they talk about being really good around the squad. Okay, that's fine. And he's started the season well. Fair play. Maguire, I don't know.
It's just not.
I like the. I just think it's a bit.
I like Gahey last season. I don't know about this season yet. I haven't seen.
Palace haven't been great though, have they? That's the thing. Another team that's gone under the radar.
Yeah, and I just think when you've got, it's a big squad, I suppose. I think it's a 28-man squad instead of 23. So if you're ever going to take 4, now's the time. But if you're talking about wanting to view people in training, even, why take 4 right backs that you know so well? If you'd said to Trippier, I'm not going to take you in this squad, that doesn't mean you're out of my World Cup squad, but I don't need to see you turn up here. Take the rest. Keep training with Newcastle. I'll come back to you. He is not going to go, well, that's outrageous. I'm retiring. You don't need him.
No, fair enough. Yeah, I agree. I'm going to wrap up the show anyway with my choice for hero, villain, and goal of the week. So see what you think. So for hero of the week, I think there's only one outstanding candidate, and that's Son. Comes off the bench, difficult start to the season, and produces a hat-trick. Probably could have had more as well. Not just that, but the goals that he scored were fantastic. So yeah, Son for me.
Son! Oh, it's another beauty!
Any other candidates stand out for you?
No, I think Son's probably the best shout, isn't he? I think the way he took his first 2 in particular, it didn't look like someone who was lacking confidence, considering it was his first goals of the season.
My villain of the week is pretty clear, isn't it? Collins for Wolves. It was just an awful challenge on Grealish. It was assault, basically, wasn't it? It could have done him some damage, and thankfully it didn't really disrupt Grealish's flow too much or injure him. But yeah, but my goal of the week, I was going to go for Fabio Vieira. I thought he's took his goal really well, but I'm going for João Palhinha for Fulham.
Yeah,
really nicely taken. Looked very spectacular as well. It's one of them goals that looked better, I think, than it probably was. But the technique, and I think he deserved it as well for his start to the season, for the way he played in that particular game. So yeah, that's my goal of the week as well. Anyway, that's the week wrapped up. Again, weird week for football with other things taking the headlines, but some good football to speak of nonetheless. Thank you both so much for joining me again, and thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. It's been great to have you here. Cheers. See you later.